So what does this not do yet? It updates the URL, but the form doesn't actually get populated, right? So what we want to do is populate the note form based on this thing from the URL instead of based on current note, because we're not setting current note anymore, right? So I think you're right. We don't need set current note. Let's just search our code for set current note. There are a bunch of references to it in main, and there's some references to it in sidebar, so let's not get rid of it just yet. But let's see if we can make note form do what we want. So note form right now uses the current note to populate the input and the text area. So we need to do this a little differently now. It needs to instead be based on those props, the value from those props. From note list to note form? Well, we're kind of already doing that. By using a nav link, we're already doing that. We're getting the ID up there, and that's being passed in. That's a nav prop, so that should be available to us. So we don't need a redirect because we have a nav link, so that's already changing the URL, and that's all redirect does. Redirect just changes the URL. And it's not like we're taking note list off the page and replacing it with form, right? They're both still there.
So then when we redirect it, we just need to go to note form.
Well, but note form's already there. Note form's already there, and we already have the right URL. So a nav link is really all we need to do. Because what we want to do is change the URL so that the ID is in there, right? So a link is adequate for that. We don't need a redirect. Because a link is basically a redirect that happens because you clicked something. So the other time we redirect based on something like an auth state changing, something that the user doesn't directly control. So we had to do it programmatically then. We had to use a redirect. But here, it happens because you clicked a link. So we are effectively redirecting, because that's what links are. But we don't need to do anything fancier than that. But we do somehow need to change what's going on inside the note form. So it's going to receive, well, if we want it to, it can receive nav props. So back in main, when we render note form now, whoops, I accidentally closed it, but I've got way too many tabs open anyway. Up in main, we render note form and we pass in the nav props. So that's history, location, and match, right? And match is the thing that has the ID. So that information is getting to note form now. Note form knows which ID is in the URL, but it needs to be able to get it out of the list of notes. So it seems maybe note form needs to know about the list of notes now, because it's up to it now to decide which note to display based on the URL. So it may seem easier to just pass the current note down in as a prop, but it's a better user experience if the URL keeps updating. And if the URL keeps updating, then we don't need to pass that down as a prop, and so we shouldn't. So up in main, we have our list of notes, right, as this.state.notes. And we already have our form props here. So maybe instead of current note, we'll do it in addition for now so we don't break stuff yet. We can pass in notes equals this.state.notes. So by updating form props here, that's the list of props that we send down to note form. So if we look at note form now in our React Dev Tools, we have history, location, and match. There's no note in the ID yet. If we click on one, there is, and we see params now has ID in it. And we see notes is now in my props. So what we basically want to do is search through that, see which one has the ID that's in the URL, and then bind that to the form. So it seems like note form now has something to keep track of. You know what I'm saying? What am I saying? No? What am I saying? Yeah, why? I need state now. Note form needs its own state to keep track of which note should be in the form. Not that hard to convert it. We'll say class note form extends component. So now we need to import component, or you could just say React.component and not have to import it. So these things now are all going to be on this.props. So I'm going to copy, not cut, or I mean, I'm going to copy these three things, put them on the clipboard so I don't forget about them. So there we go. This return value is now going to be inside a render method. So I'll indent all that. Yeah. I'm going to extract all of those variables from this.props, which doesn't fix my handled changes thing. So it shouldn't be const handles changes anymore. It's just handled changes equals arrow function. And again, it's trying to get current note, which is coming out of props. But we're going to change that anyway. But this should be this.props.save note now. I could temporarily change this to this.props.current note, but we know we're going to have to rewrite handle changes. So save note is not being used inside the render method. It's being used up here, so I don't need to break it out. Okay. So I'm going to add a constructor. We know we're going to get some props. We're going to need to pass those props up to the superclass, the constructor on the superclass. And we're going to want to set state. Where I need to keep track of the current note. I'm just going to call it note. And it should start as a blank note. So we are getting to the point where I don't think current note is going to live on main anymore. We're not quite there yet. So for right now, I'm just going to, basically I'm saying, I think sooner or later, blank note doesn't really need to be on main, because that's only there because of the form, really. But let's not delete it just yet. Let's copy it down to note form. We don't need to pass it as a prop. So let's go ahead and add the blank note method to the note form component. So note should be initialized as this dot blank note. So now the form should be bound not to current note.title, but this dot note.title and this dot note.body. Handle changes becomes this dot handle changes because it's a class now. Handle changes. This is going to change a little bit. So instead of starting with a copy of this .props.current note, it's going to be a copy of this .state.note, right? And so, yeah, we can still call this .props.saveNote and pass it on, but we also want to set state, right? Because if we don't, we're not going to be able to type. We have to update state as we handle changes. So I'll do a this.setState note. So set state, by the way, is asynchronous, meaning it happens in the background and it continues on with the next line immediately. But it doesn't return a promise, so you can't say .then. What you do instead is you pass a callback as the second argument to set state, and that thing will only run once it finishes then. So we could do a save note in the callback to set state. We don't necessarily have to, but that's a thing we could do. If we did, it would look like this. So this is saying set state, and only once you've finished updating state do you call save note. There's no particular reason we need to wait in this case, but just so you see that that's a thing that you may need to do sometimes. Sometimes you may drive yourself crazy because you swear you've updated state, and the next line is doing something with that new state, and it's not there. It's just not there. Because it just isn't quite instantaneous. Okay, so what does this get me? Can I type in the dang form? No, I can't do anything. Cannot read property title of undefined. This.note.title. I didn't mean this.note.title. I meant this.state.note.title. This.state.note.body. Right? Tappity tappity. Okay, I can type in these things and it creates notes still. But I'm still not changing the form when I click this. So what is happening in the life cycle of the component when I click on one of these? What is happening, period, when I click on one of these? I can go ahead and save what we did here. We add state to note form. What's happening when I click on one of those? It's not a trick question. What's happening when I click one of those? What's the one thing that changes? When the URL changes, right? So how could note form find out about that? How will note form find out that the URL changed? Location will change. Match will also change because it's got params in it. So its props change, right? Its props will change every time we click on a new note. And yesterday we learned about component will receive props. So in note form, we could add that. Component will receive props. Let's make it an arrow function. And you may remember it received the new props as an argument. So what the props are about to change to. And when we did this yesterday, we needed to kind of be careful that it had actually changed. So let's get the new ID out of there. Const new ID equals, so new props dot match dot params dot ID. Does that make sense? Let's look at note form. After clicking one of these, note form, props dot match dot params dot ID will be the ID. Then what we want to do is update this.state.note to be the note with that ID. How can we do that? We've done that before. I think save note basically does that, right? Using find index. Remember that? So const I equals not notes, but new props dot notes. Because we have the list of notes inside our props. Find index, current note, compare current note.id to this ID right here, to new ID. And then I can set const note equal new props dot notes square bracket I. If it was found. So if that's a thing, if note, oops. If note, this set state note. So you see what I'm doing? Get the ID out of the URL. Get the ID from the URL. Find the note with that ID. Update state with the new note, with that note, if found. Every time the props change. Let's see. Looks like I've got a warning. What's my warning? Current note is assigned a value but never used on note form, line 45. Line 45. Yeah, so I'm not even using current note out of my props anymore. Note to self. All right, let's click on one of these. Darn it. Nothing happened. Why not? Let's have a look at my form component, note form. We're going to take a break really soon. State, note, body is still nothing. To make sure component will receive props is doing anything at all. Console.log, new props. Okay, I'm getting some new props. Click, I get new props again. Click, I get new props again. So that's running. So what's the problem? Let's console log new ID. Undefined, undefined. Click one. There's my ID. Cool. So it's finding the new ID. Let's console log I. Okay, -1, -1, nothing was found. Click 1, nothing was found still. New props. So notes is being passed in as a prop. It should be. Let's look at that. Let's look at form. I did do that, right? Notes. Yeah, notes. Here it is. Here's the array. But I'm not finding it for some reason. So current note is just the name of each note in new props.notes as I loop through. Console log new props.notes. Okay, here's the array. So it's there. Click on one. That array is still there, but I'm not finding the one with the ID I'm looking for. So I think it is an array, yeah. See the square brackets? It's an array of objects. But notice, it looks like these are numbers. There's no quotes around them. And the param is a string. So I'm comparing a string to a number here. So probably the easiest thing to do is just say to string. There it works. And I think I should still be able to edit these. Yep. So I can get rid of my console logs. So now if we click new note, it doesn't clear out the form because that sets current note, right? And current note isn't being used anywhere else except on that button, right? So that's the next thing we should probably do. So what did we accomplish so far? Populate the form based on the ID and the URL, the route param. But yeah, we broke this button. So we still have another thing to fix.